And we are back. What a day we're having. After so many great events, we have a few more after this 5-minute break. So let's keep on marching. So I am so lucky. I feel so lucky to present to you for the panel on international investments in space. We have had this morning a panel on investing in space. This panel will focus much more on the international aspects of investment in space with Raphael Roettgen, managing partner of E2MC, based in Zurich in Switzerland, and Jeff Cruzy, investment manager of Seraphim Capital, based in London, UK. Please join me in welcoming two of our panelists. Hello, Raphael. Hello, Jeff.
Hi there.
Hi, everyone.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, right off the bat, let's. It's our audience is mostly U.S. based or much more familiar with the U.S. market. So please introduce yourself and yourselves and your organization. Let's start with Raphael.
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here at MIT Sloan. So my name is Raphael Roettgen, and yes, I sit in Zurich. I'm originally a German citizen, and I'm the managing partner, as you said, of something called E2MC Ventures. E2MC actually stands for Earth to Mars Capital, although usually you just use the name E2MC. And it's a seed stage venture fund that's solely dedicated to the space industry, where we invest in seed stage startups in the space sector globally. We raised our first fund last year. It's now almost fully invested already. We just started raising our second fund. And you know what's special about E2MC, I think, is we're a mix actually of investment professionals. That's namely me. I have about 20 years or so of experience on Wall Street in various investment roles. And my partners have something like close to 100 years of combined space experience in various roles as executives and even as successful space entrepreneurs. So, you know, we aim to provide much more than capital, we like to say. I myself am also very active in space outreach. And some of you may know I'm the host of something called the Space Business Podcast, which is on all platforms. I wrote a popular book on this on space business, unfortunately only available in German for now. And I teach on space at a few universities, including something called the International Space University, that some of you may know, and which was in fact founded right here at MIT in 1987.
That's an awesome background. Thank you so much. Please, Jeff, introduce yourself and about your organization.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Cruzy. I'm based in London, but you can probably tell from the accent that I'm not from here. Born and raised in San Diego. Joined Seraphim at the beginning of 2020, so relatively new to the team still. But myself, my academic background is in business, but I've worked between operational roles and investment roles in clean tech, AR, VR, and space for most of my career. Most recently, I was part of the corporate strategy and development team at Viasat, a more established satellite communications company back in the US, working across commercial and government projects. So Seraphim is a roughly $90 million fund investing in seed, but primarily focused on Series A. We also have an accelerator that we run 2 cohorts of twice a year. And then we also just our latest AWS partnered space accelerator. And we've got a portfolio of roughly 19 companies. And I'd say geographically, we're split 1/3 US, 1/3 UK, 1/3 EU.
That's a great portfolio, and it sounds like a great geographic split, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So just for the audience, we will be accepting Q&A. So please feel free to let the questions come in, and we'll be tackling those by the end of the panel. To Raphael, let's start with you. Tell us more about founding a VC fund in the space industry, and more specifically, what were the challenges or questions you had to face while raising funds from LPs as a space tech VC in Europe?
Yeah, and I don't think it's limited to Europe, to be honest. And my partners actually sit in the US, so we somewhere straddle Europe and the US. Of course, I sit in Europe. I think, though, the questions we face are probably pretty common for space or people who are trying to do space VCs around the world. And, you know, I'm sure Jeff has a similar experience. So it includes things like, you know, the LPs ask you, well, how do you actually make money in space? You know, what are the business models? I think another thing that's happening is, at least until recently, a lot of people have sort of, let's call it an availability bias. When they think of space, they think of rocket companies. And that sort of primes them in certain ways. They think, okay, rocket companies, that's really expensive. It's really capital intensive. And, it probably takes quite a few years, for many rocket companies, almost 10 years, to actually have a product out there and start making revenue, right? So it kind of scares them, capital intensive, long time to revenue. And so you have to explain that there is other business models where that's actually not the case, where you might make revenue very, very quickly, and which are very capital light, like, for example, business models which analyze satellite data. Another thing, people are just afraid because it's deep tech, right? I mean, it's not something you pick up and you immediately understand. But of course, that's also an argument why you should use people like us and Seraphim, because we know how to do the due diligence. And lastly, at least until recently, one thing that always came up is the lack of exits. And my response used to be, and to some extent it continues to be, that, like, look, I think space is right now somewhere, or like comparable to where the internet was in the mid-90s. And like, how many internet access did you have in the mid-90s? It's just a cycle, right? It just takes some time. Having said that, we're now reaching the part of the cycle where we're starting to have some exits. And the other thing that's controversial, it certainly helped on the exits, SPAC thing.
Absolutely. I think the SPAC craze of last year has definitely changed how LPs perceive a lot of tech companies, especially those that are generating revenues a little bit slower than typical asset-light internet companies. So Jeff, what unique advantages do you have by being in Europe? Your background is also interesting because you are originally from San Diego, but then now you are in London, so you must have a very interesting perspective on the advantages of being where you are.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head. Being an American in the UK, sort of straddling both, it is to my advantage because there are marked differences in the risk profiles of the investors in the UK and EU versus the US. But there's also benefits to having inroads to some of the larger customers in the US, namely the US government, which is often the most consistent industry. The way I think about it is I'm just sort of a conduit to help companies commercially expand in the US, but also I still help them in the EU and the UK as well.
I see. And perhaps a interesting question, since both of you are split both in personal background as also how the organizational chart is split, is do European space companies, or let's say international space non-US based companies, need a US presence to be successful, or is it more of it's kind of a little bit of an availability bias, just as you said, Raphael? What would you say, Jeff, about that topic?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely to any company's benefit that's in the space industry to be well aligned with their US counterparts. I think many of the companies that we've invested in that didn't originate in the US have eventually opened up offices to do business, with the DoD, with NASA, with the various branches. So I think, any truly international company is probably going to have an office in the US.
I see. And is that also an observation you have, Raphael?
Yeah, I agree with Jeff there. I think, I could sort of split it into at least three parts, some of which Jeff already alluded to. I mean, one is just the customers. And a lot of your customers are, not all of them, but a lot of them can be based in the US, including the government customers that Jeff mentioned. And the other part is funding, and there's just a lot of funding available in the US. There's a lot of, deep tech VC funds, there's some space specialized funds, and at all stages, right? So that's also an argument. And I think the third thing I'd like to add is exit potential, right? And that's something where, I'm a European and I root for Europe, but we have to do some work on the exits, because a lot of the exit potential for now, at least, is in the US, with the big aerospace companies, and the entire SPAC phenomenon. That's, at least for now, that's almost 100% a US phenomenon.
Got it. So a lot of it is like financing, not only looking for revenue generation, but also access to capital markets and access to the investors. And talking about all these transactions, investment in space are very much related, not every, but many times subject to CFIUS and national security concerns. And we hear that all the time, especially when we do newspapers, especially with rising geopolitical tensions around the world. from semiconductors to a lot of key technologies, especially pertaining to aerospace, are subject to national security concerns. And so when you are based from outside of the US and you want the portfolio companies or just companies in general to have a US presence, to have access to capital markets and also exit potential, what are the different challenges that you had to face as investors from across the ocean? And we can start with Jeff on that question.
Well, if you're asking about what challenges we face with the investors, obviously we have to be diligent in terms of who we co-invest with, making sure that the syndicate will stand up to scrutiny from the U.S. government. But also, I think one of the ways that we've also mitigated the risk in terms of CFIUS controls or ITAR controls is by having our companies UK based when they can be. And the reason for that is, a Five Eyes ally company or company headquartered in a Five Eyes allied country, it gets treated a little bit less rigorously than companies from other countries would typically be.
I see. That makes sense to be from a country that is much closer, geopolitically speaking, to the U.S. What about you, Raphael? Like based from non-Five Eyes country, and also we're aware now that you have a partner who is based in the U.S. Have you ever, nonetheless, faced any issues with national security concerns?
Well, we haven't yet, and so I have two partners who are both in the U.S. and U.S. citizens. But let me just point out, this can cut both ways as well, right? It can sometimes also be an advantage. Like you could have, U.S. companies face export restrictions, right? And you may have European companies which face much fewer export restrictions and hence can sell their product more easily to, let's call it third-party countries, right? Now, of course, as Jeff said, we are very sort of conscious of CFIUS concerns as well, right? And it kind of goes down the chain, right? I mean, we have to think about sort of our LP base as well, and make sure that that's not going to become unpalatable, so to say, for U.S. CFIUS purposes. And it's a moving target, right? I mean, it's politics at the end of the day, and it changes. We've all seen the sanctions yesterday, right, and the counter reaction today. So it's a strategic business. Certainly seen as a strategic. I think it's seen as a strategic business around the world, to be honest. I mean, certainly in the US, but now also increasingly in Europe. The European Union is saying space is a strategic business, and it's already having some implications here within Europe, and even within the EU, like between the EU and the UK and Switzerland. I mean, many more implications and complications than I would personally like to see as a European, but it's just a fact.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned before about access to capital markets investors, and since you mentioned that, I have a follow-up question to that is. What are the major differences in terms of public financing sources in Europe versus the US?
As a public, I assume you don't mean public markets, you mean like governmental and quasi-governmental sources. Yes. Yeah, good question. So, I mean, we do have public funding sources on both sides of the Atlantic, for sure. So in the US, obviously, we have NASA, but what we also have in the US is the entire sort of military and then intelligence community complex. And that, of course, for political reasons, there's much less of that in Europe. It isn't zero, but it tends to be more sort of, I think, individual countries. Like now, for example, we have a space force in France, or an equivalent of a space force in France. And I know a couple of startups who have already kind of basically obtained financing and contracts from them. So it's happening, but it's not on the same scale in the US, where, if you add up the DoD in its various forms and the intelligence community, I mean, it's a very significant budget, right? Even compared to the NASA budget. And that we don't have an equivalent of in Europe. Having said that, the NASA equivalent in Europe, the ESA, they're giving out a lot of contracts, they're giving out financing. Various national space agencies, like the UK Space Agency, are giving out non-dilutive financing. So we do have some interesting public financing options in Europe, for sure.
I see. Jeff, you wanted to?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say I very much agree. I think the scale of it's different in the U.S. From the UK and the EU. What I like that's happening now is we're seeing less single source contracts, and those contracts are being spread out to a variety of companies competing for similar ends, and I think that breeds better competition in terms of distributing that non-dilutive funding. It doesn't just silo it in one company, which is never to the public's advantage.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to you, Jeff, then regarding different types of funding to different kinds of clients in the U.S. and Europe, how do you approach building a portfolio of U.S. and non-U.S. space companies? So you said you have a third in the U.S., a third in the U.K., and a third in Europe, and continent to Europe. So one would imagine that building a space company in all of those three different geographies require different ways of thinking, different business building wisdoms that are not necessarily transferable from go-to-market strategies to technology roadmaps and regulatory environments. So how do you, as an investor, how do you navigate all those differences?
Very carefully. So it's there's no single formula to it all. I think one of the things that we think about a lot of times is the market, and I think it's not as simple to say for a company the market is X billions of dollars. There's mechanics to it all, and Raphael already touched on part of it, which is there are national priorities within different regions of the world that can contract or expand the size of these markets. So those mechanics we have to think a lot about. But then, as Raphael also touched on, is funding. I think there's not nearly as large a venture capital pool in the UK and the EU, and so oftentimes we'll start off with early funding here in the US or here in the UK or the EU, and then the larger checks will often come from US investors, and that's just sort of matter of fact. And then it's also important not to discount the quality of talent we have in the UK and the EU, though. It is tremendous. It's world class, and so that is something that we look very, very closely at, outside of all the technology moats that you could think of. But those are just a few areas that we scrutinize.
Absolutely. And how about you, Raphael? When you observe, when you do due diligence, when you invest in companies of different geographies in space, how do you adjust the insights that you would like to share, or advice that you share with the entrepreneurs in terms of how to build and scale companies in different geographies?
Well, I think so. But with seed stage investors, so for example, the team is just very important. So evaluating who's a good team, who's a good entrepreneur, I don't think it really changes that much between geographies. By and large, evaluating a market potential doesn't change that much. Of course, with the exception, as Jeff was alluding to, so you have to sort of like see the local context and how big is the local market, if it is limited to the local market, or if your first customers are in the local market. So the technical due diligence is another thing that doesn't really change, right? Because the laws of physics are the same around the world. So that's the same. So I think some of the key things which are really different geography by geography is, again, sort of like, okay, what's the local market like? If that's where you start selling, who are the local customers? And then, as we've talked about in the previous question, sort of the local support mechanisms, be it by virtue of public funding or private funding, the venture capital community, as Jeff was mentioning, or be it by virtue of, again, sources of revenue.
One thing I would add is there seems to be a common denominator that I'm picking up on, and Raphael, you tell me if you've seen this, but some of the more successful companies in our portfolio have been incredibly good at getting non-dilutive funding very early on, and leveraging that against matched funding to accelerate their development.
Yeah, I agree to that. You have some people who are really sort of scrappy in that sense and motivated. And again, there is public funding sources to access. We've had seed rounds where we come into the seed round, but the guys already had like millions of dollars of like various government like grants, non-dilutive funding. So I agree with that.
That is great to hear. As an entrepreneur, it's always getting non-dilutive funding is one of the best. Not only the best traction that you can get as a stamp of approval, but also the best feeling for not having diluted your capital table and being able to finance your activities. Let's talk about your investments economics, and this may not be necessarily for international investors, but more specifically to both of you and in your fund. What are the exit opportunities that you see the most realistic, or that you are most looking into for your current investments? You have mentioned, Raphael, that it's always an issue when you go to LPs, and it's difficult to imagine because there's no precedent or not a lot of precedent of space companies going through exits. And so we're really curious to learn about how you sell the stories to LPs or how you justify the economics of each investment. Let's start with you. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, there's the classic routes of exit, right? I mean, sort of you have you can sell to a strategic buyer, and those things are happening, right? I mean, so like example, what's a recent example? Blue Canyon being sold to I think it was Raytheon, right? So we actually had every month now we have a number of sort of aerospace M&A transactions. So that is happening. The other thing, actually, with regard to M&A transactions, was quite interesting. We now have at least a couple of players, namely Redwire, which just went through a SPAC, but then also Voyager Space Holdings, which are clearly doing roll-up strategies, right? Now, I'm not sure either one of them is going to touch any of our portfolio companies, but sort of, that's another thing how you could get an exit if you're a space company. Like you get rolled up into a bigger vehicle that then tries to basically publicly list. Speaking of public listing, that's another one, right? And then you can kind of split it in two. There's the traditional route, the IPO, if people remember that. And a recent example, there's actually a recent example in the space sector, which is MDA in Canada. So that is still an option, right? Obviously, there's certain requirements typically in most places for IPOs in terms of like a history the company needs to have, financial history. And then, of course, what's very hot and has been very hot recently, what already mentioned, is the whole SPAC thing. So the special purpose acquisition companies, right, which are basically companies that list, take in cash, basically our shell with cash, and then merge with a target company. And it's happened since last October. It's happened 7 times. And then before that, there were a few examples as well. So that's a very prominent exit route at the moment.
It's great to hear.
But Jeff can tell much. So we are actually too young to actually have any exits. Jeff can give us some specific examples, actually.
Yeah, I'll shamelessly plug 2 of our companies that have de-SPACed: AST, Space Mobile, and Spire. So I think it's not fair to say that it's entirely bubble behavior. I can appreciate why people think that it looks like that, and that it is driving some companies to go public before than they probably should. But I do think SPACs, especially for space, are here to stay because it's well aligned with the capital needs of space specifically. But I also think it's setting the stage for some much larger, maybe more traditional IPOs not too long from now. So I expect to see companies that are doing very, very well right now to maybe go the more traditional route perhaps, or directly list. But yes, I also agree with Raphael's observation in terms of holding companies. I think we'll see more of those. I think that's just a budding trend right now. And that companies like you can see companies like Founders or funds like Founders Fund that are investing in companies sort of like in a picket fence strategy around a central company. And I think that it wouldn't surprise me if we started to see them do roll-up strategies themselves. So yeah,
absolutely. And maybe something that I've been hearing many times is you touched upon this SPAC being aligned with the funding journey and the capital requirements of building a space company. And I think I've met more than I expected people thinking that just like in biotech where companies IPO or go public before even having their products that go through phase 3 clearance in the FDA, and it's become almost standard that they would go into the public market way before the product is ready. And would you say that for a space company that requires a lot of capital, that kind of thinking or that kind of funding timeline is going to be either standard or very normal in a few years in the space industry? Jeff?
I don't know that it'll be standard ever, but I think it'll be more common within space than within other industries. Yeah, I mean, but let's also not forget that not every single space company is capital intensive. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of downstream companies that I expect we'll see more of that are productizing and verticalizing a little bit more around specific business lines. I think we're seeing a lot of that in the insurance industry, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, so. Yeah.
I see. That's a great point. From the audience, we have a question, and I think I can direct that to Raphael. One question is, the Luxembourg model has done a great job of accelerating a focused aspect of commercial space. So where is the next Luxembourg-like country initiative in the EU/UK?
I sit in Switzerland, so I'm going to very self-servingly say I hope it's here, and I'm trying to do my part in terms of lobbying with politicians and being involved with organizations like what used to be the Swiss Space Center, now called Swiss Space Innovation. To make that happen, there's at least, if not on a federal level, then on what we call in Swiss cantons, which are like US states, right? There are some very motivated cantons, like the canton of Vaud, which the main city is Lausanne, which hosts one of the two Swiss institutes of technology, and actually the Swiss Institute of Technology, which has an aeroastro program, a space program. So I really hope it's here, and why I'm hoping this is because we have an absolutely amazing base of engineering talent in Switzerland. So I think we have a lot going for it, but it's not the only country, right? I mean, clearly the Emirates are trying to do it. They're trying to copy a Luxembourg model, and they've actually even hired some people from Luxembourg to help out with that, and then there's a few other places around the world.
Yep, I see. Another question from the audience is, and this is of course a really interesting question to both of you as investors. In the short to midterm, what are the most exciting and attractive verticals or areas of the space industry that you are following? I think we can start with Jeff for this one.
So the way I kind of like to think about it is, to date, we've had companies that have been designing to fly on the Falcon 9 and put that layer of infrastructure in orbit. And it's still very early on. I don't, fantasize about it being, nearly done yet. But what I think about into the future is, well, what are the companies that are going to be designing for Starship? What do those companies look like? What does that economy enable? So, perhaps that's, the start of the cislunar economy. And that's what we need to really be thinking about. But then again, I also think about things on orbit that we still haven't really fleshed out yet. So on-orbit manufacturing is an area that I've been working on since 2012. And then, everything that comes along with that, because once you can manufacture in space, then you can do servicing, you can do, building of infrastructure without needing to launch it necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Raphael, what's your take to that question?
Well, I mean, first of all, I have to agree with Jeff. I mean, he hit the nail on the head there with Starship, like companies that actually have the ambition that they design something that is only enabled by Starship. That's fantastic. And we really wish there were more of them. So guys, we need more companies that are thinking like big, think big. Just think about if you have a capacity of like, let's call it 100 tons to low Earth orbit at like, cost of hundreds in the dollars. What would you do with that? Just think about it. And then send us your business plans, please. So that's one. Second, I also fully agree with Jeff on orbit manufacturing. I think we're only scratching the surface on that, right? Because the only sort of platform we have for that at the moment is the International Space Station, which was never designed as a manufacturing facility. It was designed as a limited scale government laboratory, and it's doing an absolutely fantastic job at that, right? But it's not a good manufacturing facility. There's too much contamination. There's astronauts knocking stuff around. The whole thing gets knocked around by capsules docking, de-docking. It's actually not at an ideal altitude for microgravity. I could go, there's oxygen leaking. I could go on, right? So we need specific platforms for that. Actually, E2MC just now invested recently in one of those, which is not public yet, so I can't talk about it. But I think that's a very exciting topic in like microgravity manufacturing. There's a number of use cases, advanced materials. There's a number of biotech use cases. There's the whole other thing. So biotech materials, I'm talking about what we could call manufacturing in microgravity for Earth to bring it back. Then, of course, there's the whole thing where you can manufacture in space for use in space as well. And actually, since we're at MIT, I should point out, I think it's Professor Olivier de Weck who's doing some work in that regard on in-space manufacturing.
Yes, we do know him very well. For during my time at MIT, I listened to a lot of like Course 16 aeroastro classes, and he was always this name that floats around always. So, as a follow-up question from members of the audience for that is, with someone with ties to the region, to both of you, do you see any promising opportunities in the Central and Eastern European region, including Russia? Jeff, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, we've made investments in Finnish companies. We definitely survey the landscape for companies, no matter where they are. I think I would be dishonest if I said we were looking at Russia, and that has a lot to do with what we discussed earlier in terms of import-export controls, and that got momentous in a lot of hot water. I don't think any investor wants that
Sure.
trouble anytime soon. So it ate us similarly for China, and that's just the world we live in these days.
No, absolutely. Raphael, what about like Eastern European EU countries? Do you see any opportunities outside of Western Europe, more in the Eastern Hemisphere?
Yeah, I mean, we were certainly happy to look at it, and there's some things emerging, for example, in the Baltics. I mean, think about it like a very prominent satellite company, Nanoavionics, right? They're from the Baltic republics. Another very prominent satellite company, Indurosat, from Bulgaria, and still based in Bulgaria. So I mean, there's certainly examples. If we really kind of move into Russia, then unfortunately, Jeff is right. You're kind of getting, even though you have just absolutely amazing, obviously historical knowledge base, particularly on rocket engines, right? In places like, well, not only Russia, right? I should definitely also mention the Ukraine, right? And keep in mind that a lot of the original Russian rocket technology came from Glushko, who was a Ukrainian, right? Yeah, but both the Ukraine, Russia, again, I have to be honest, like Jeff is, and it's very difficult for us to take a look.
Absolutely. Of course, we talk more about the mechanical engineer part or the computer science part. One member of the audience is curious about major investments or interesting investments, a potential that you see in health programs or medical research for space travel. Can just continue with Raphael.
No, I think there's tremendous opportunity. And again, look, the human body, as soon as you go into microgravity, it's subjected to tremendous stresses, right? And you can take whole classes on that, what's happening, but none of the stuff that's happening is pretty. Let me put it this way, right? I mean, this is why the guys on the ISS, I think, have to work out, I think on average 2 hours every day, right? So to counteract muscle atrophy and they have bone loss, right? But then, of course, you can use that and try to develop things which counteract that can help us in the future when we kind of go to places which are further away, or you go back to the moon, let alone if you go to Mars, right? But it could also even have use cases on Earth, and there's even historical precedents for that. So as I mentioned, one of the things that's happening in microgravity, immediately you start having bone loss, right? So we've had in the past experiments back in the day, even on the space shuttle, which contributed to directly contributed to the development of osteoporosis drugs. This has already happened, and I think we're going to have more use cases like that in the future. I really hope so. Honestly, anything that's pharma, biotech, and space, we wish we would find more companies to invest in.
Yeah, I would say one of the other areas that I've seen a lot of other companies in are food production. You have different needs in space when you're trying to do things like get to Mars. So we're always keeping our eyes open for interesting companies that are working on that problem.
That's very, very interesting. In the interest of time, we have 2 minutes left, so I would like to just open it up to you for just final thoughts on the topic of international investment in space. And Jeff, if you have any insights or final thoughts to share about that topic.
Oh, final thoughts. Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just reiterate, and also echo what Raphael said, is like, think big. We've got a lot of Earth observation companies already. Think beyond that. We need to start thinking, Sizzler in our economy, designing for a Starship, and what's next. And don't worry about capital intensity. I think that is an unreasonable fear for a lot of investors, because I don't think anybody's worried about the capital intensity of a company like SpaceX or Black Sky or Planet. Like, it's
absolutely. And Raphael, any final thoughts before we leave?
Yeah, I would like to motivate potential entrepreneurs, existing and potential entrepreneurs. Like, it doesn't matter where you sit. Again, I think this is similar to the internet in the mid-90s. And in the mid-90s with the internet, it may have seemed that like, oh my God, all of these exciting things like Netscape, Amazon, it's all in the US. Well, it wasn't. You had things like Skype. It doesn't matter where you sit. If you're like a qualified, well, definitely if you're a qualified engineer, but you don't even have to be an engineer, or maybe you have a co-founder as an engineer, but you're just excited about this moment in space. It doesn't matter where you are. Ultimately, as we discussed, you may have to move, you may have to open up a US office. That's fine. But if you're at MIT, but you're European, you want to go back to Europe, do that. Go to a place like Luxembourg or Switzerland or the UK or other countries, right? You can found a space company anywhere. If you're an MIT student and you're from India, you can definitely go back to India, which is definitely opening up right now, sort of similar moment to the US 20 years ago, to have a commercial space system. It doesn't matter where you are. If you're excited by it, just go for it.
Great. And with those encouraging insights and thoughts, we were at time. So again, thank you so much, Jeff and Raphael, for participating. We've really thoroughly enjoyed having you here. And we wish you the best of luck for your fund and for your return investments. And we hope to have you back next year.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Hope so too.